She gave him everything, and he threw her away like yesterday's ash. Martha Doyle spent the best years of her life building a man's dream with her own 2 hands, only to be told she was too much, too broad, too rough for the world he had climbed into. But out on the merciless western plains, where the wind cuts like a blade, and civilization is nothing but a distant rumor, a quiet man with careful eyes begins to see her in a way no one ever has. And when the sky splits open and the blizzard swallows them whole, what passes between them will either save her soul or shatter what little remains of it. Stay with me to the very end. Drop your city in the comments below, and let's begin. The morning Martha Doyle left Carterville, she did not look back. There was nothing sentimental in that decision, no dramatic turning away from a beloved skyline or a cherished street corner. She simply climbed up onto the running board of the supply wagon, settled her weight onto the hard wooden bench, and fixed her eyes on the western horizon, where the sky was still the color of cold iron. The town behind her held nothing anymore. Whatever softness she had once felt for it had been burned out of her the previous autumn on a Tuesday evening in September, in the parlor of the house she had helped furnish with her own wages when Gerald Holt had told her in a voice of almost clinical calm that he would not be marrying her after all. He had not been unkind about it in the way that a man with a certain kind of social confidence is never unkind. He had simply stated the facts as he understood them. He had done well for himself. People were watching him now. He was being invited to dinners he had never been invited to before, and the wives of those men, the women who sat at those tables, were of a particular type. Slender, fashionable, polished. He had looked at Martha across that parlor, with its curtains she had sewn and its floors she had scrubbed, and he had said with the same tone a man might use to explain why he was trading in an old workhorse that she was not the kind of woman who would serve him well in those rooms. "You are a fine worker, Martha," he had said. "You always have been, but there is a difference between what a man needs in the kitchen and what a man needs on his arm." She had not wept in front of him. She had pride enough left for that. She had nodded once with a steadiness that must have surprised him because she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not regret exactly. Something closer to relief that she was not going to make a scene. She had walked out of that parlor and not stopped walking until she was back in the small rented room above the dry goods store where she had been sleeping for the past 3 years, ever since she had given up her own modest boarding room to pour every spare cent into Gerald's fledgling freight business. 3 years of rising before dawn to make his books balance. 3 years of stretching a thin budget across payroll and supply costs and bribes to the county assessor. 3 years of mending leather harnesses by lamplight because the cost of a repairman was too high. And 6 years before that, 7 years, a full decade, stretching back to when she was 22, and he was a charming young man with ambitious eyes and no money at all, during which she had cooked for his crew, managed his household, organized his records, and in every practical sense been the invisible architecture upon which his visible success was built. She did not tally this up in the days after, not consciously. There was no formal accounting. There was only the hollow space where her certainty had been, and the particular cold that fills a person when they understand in their bones rather than their mind that they have been thoroughly and completely used. She did not apply for the position with the Cowboy Transport Company out of courage. She applied because it was the only work being offered that week that did not require a letter of reference from someone in Carterville, and she was done with Carterville. The advertisement had been nailed to the post outside the land office. Head cook wanted, overland transport run, 6-month contract, good wages, no prior rail experience necessary. The pay was nearly double what she could make in any domestic position in town, and the job was by its very nature as far from Gerald Holt's world as the plains of the American West could put her. She had the interview with the transport manager, a barrel-chested man named Silas Finn in the back office of a livery stable that smelled of sawdust and old leather. Finn had looked her over in the direct, unsentimental way of a man who was accustomed to assessing physical capability in the bodies he hired. "It is not easy work," he had said. "I want to be plain about that. You will be cooking 3 meals a day for a crew of 14 men, sometimes more. You will be hauling and lifting and working in heat that would drop a lesser person. The kitchen car is cramped and the stove is old and the country we are crossing is not forgiving." "I am not looking for forgiving," Martha had told him. He had studied her for another long moment, taking in her broad shoulders and her strong hands and the quality of absolute immovable steadiness in her dark eyes. Then he had nodded and slid the contract across the desk. She signed it without reading every line, which was not like her. But she was done being careful. Careful had gotten her a decade of invisible labor and a Tuesday evening in a parlor she had furnished herself. The kitchen car was exactly as Finn had described it, and possibly worse. It was a long, narrow iron box, perpetually smoke-stained, mounted on the last working section of a freight train that had seen better decades. The stove was a massive, ancient cast-iron beast that ran on wood and demanded constant feeding. The oven door was hung on a hinge, so rusted and misaligned that opening it required a particular technique involving one's hip and a specific downward force that Martha discovered through trial and error on her first morning, along with a bruise on her right thigh that lasted nearly 2 weeks. The workspace was organized, she quickly learned, according to no logic whatsoever. Pots were stored on the lowest shelf, which meant hauling them up to the stove height with her back bent at the wrong angle. The dry stores were packed in heavy wooden crates that slid to the back of the space during movement, so that every meal began with a 15-minute exercise in retrieval. The cutting board was fixed at a height suited for a man several inches shorter than the average, so Martha spent her first days hunched over it, feeling the particular ache begin to build between her shoulder blades that would become in time as familiar as breathing. The crew paid her almost no attention, which she had expected, and which suited her fine. To 14 working men on a long haul, the cook was a functional necessity like the wheels or the water supply. They noticed her only when the food was late or insufficient, and since Martha's food was neither of those things, they did not notice her much at all. She served them and cleared after them and rebuilt her workspace after the evening meal and rose before any of them to start the morning fires, and in this way the first 2 weeks passed in a kind of numb, mechanical rhythm that was not peace exactly, but was at least the absence of the particular pain she had been running from. She did not think about Gerald Holt, or rather she did not allow herself to. When his face rose in her mind, she redirected the energy into the work. She channeled it into the precise, demanding labor of making food for hard-working men out of limited provisions in a moving, swaying iron box. She became extraordinarily good at it, not because she needed the validation of their approval, but because excellence was the only language she had left that felt like her own. She had always cooked with a kind of physical intelligence that she could not fully articulate. Her body knew things that her mind had not yet formulated. She knew when a broth needed another hour by the sound it made in the pot. She knew how to adjust a bread recipe for altitude and humidity without measuring. She knew the particular moment when the caramelization of onions shifted from sweet to bitter, and she caught it every time without watching the clock. These were gifts she had never been thanked for, skills she had exercised in service of other people's tables for her entire adult life. Out here on the plains in the smoke-stained kitchen car, they were purely and finally her own. But the body keeps a reckoning even when the mind refuses to. By the end of the 3rd week, Martha felt it in the way she could not. The wrist that ached when she gripped the cast-iron handle of the largest soup pot. The slow, grinding protest in her lower back that began around mid-morning and built steadily through the day. The particular exhaustion that was not ordinary tiredness, but something deeper, something that lived in the tissues, a cumulative debt that her body was beginning to call in with interest. She did not slow down. She had not been built for slowing down, and more than that, she had not been built, she believed, for the kind of vulnerability that asking for help would require. Vulnerability had not served her. Vulnerability was what she had felt when she believed Gerald Holt loved her, when she had softened herself toward him and opened the quiet rooms of her heart, and it had cost her everything. So she kept her face steady and her pace relentless, and if she gripped the stove rail a little longer than necessary, some mornings before she began, there was no one to see it. There was one man, though, who had a habit of seeing things. His name was Luke Harper, and he had come aboard at the last supply stop, traveling with a small herd of horses that were being transported to a ranch near the Red Ridge Pass. He was the kind of man who did not announce himself. He was perhaps 35, lean and broad-shouldered, with the particular kind of quietness that comes not from shyness, but from a long habit of watchfulness. He had a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor living, deeply lined at the eyes and mouth, with a quality of stillness to it that Martha might have found unnerving if she had been paying him any attention, which she was not. He sat at the far end of the eating bench during meals, which meant he was almost always the last to be served and the last to leave. The other men talked over and around each other in the loud, overlapping way of men who spend a great deal of time in each other's company and have long since stopped listening to what anyone else is actually saying. Luke rarely contributed to these exchanges. He would sometimes answer a direct question with a single, precise sentence, and then return to whatever quiet observation he had been engaged in before he was interrupted. He thanked her for the food, every single meal without exception. Not effusively, not with the oily, excessive gratitude that Martha would have distrusted on instinct, but quietly and directly, meeting her eyes for a brief moment before looking away. It was such a small thing that she almost did not notice it the first several times. When she did notice it, she told herself it was merely good manners that she should not assign significance to a man's ordinary decency. But she began against her better intentions to notice other things about him. The way he watched the horizon while the other men watched each other. The fact that he never raised his voice even when the train lurched and the eating bench upset, and a man's tin mug of coffee went clattering across the floor. The way he moved through the train with an economy of motion that suggested someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary movement was a form of waste the land would not forgive. She told herself firmly and repeatedly that she was not interested in noticing Luke Harper. She had excellent reasons for this policy, all of them named Gerald Holt, and she intended to maintain it absolutely. On a Thursday morning in the 4th week, Martha arrived at the kitchen car in the pre-dawn dark to find the firewood already chopped. She stood in the doorway for a long moment holding her lantern, looking at the neat stack of split wood beside the stove. It had been chopped to exactly the length she needed, which was not the standard length, which was too long, by 3 inches for the stove's firebox, and required a secondary splitting that she had been performing every morning with an old hand axe crouched on the floor of the car in a posture that made the ache in her shoulders worse by midday. Someone had noticed this. Someone had understood the problem, not in the abstract, but in the specific mechanical, practical terms of how the length of wood related to the dimensions of the firebox and what that cost a person's body over time, and they had corrected it. She looked around the empty car. There was no one. Outside the small, smudged window, the planes rolled by in the early gray light, vast and indifferent. She set the lantern down on the work shelf and stood there a moment longer than she needed to, with her hands folded in front of her, and felt something she could not name move through her chest. It was not happiness, not exactly. It was more like the sensation of a door that has been shut and bolted for a very long time, beginning almost imperceptibly to give. She lit the stove and began breakfast and said nothing to anyone. 2 mornings later, she reached for the oven door, with both hands braced herself for the usual resistance, and it swung open cleanly and smoothly, with a sound that was barely a sound at all. The rusted hinge had been oiled. More than oiled, she could see, when she examined it, the pin had been reseated, and the plate had been tightened, a full repair job done with care and competence in the dead of night, when no one would see it and no credit could be taken. She stood with her hand on the oven door for a long moment, her throat doing something she did not permit it to do. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, and returned to the bread she was forming, moving her hands with the precise, firm rhythm that was her oldest comfort. She did not go looking for Luke Harper to thank him. She was afraid of what she might say if she did. Or, more precisely, she was afraid of what she might feel, and feeling things for men was a practice she had recently decided to retire from. But she found herself at his meal that evening, setting down his plate with a fraction more care than usual, and when she met his eyes in the brief, habitual exchange of his thanks, she held the look perhaps a half-second longer than before. He did not smile, but something in his expression shifted very slightly in a way that suggested he understood that she had received the message and that it had been received correctly. This was, she told herself sternly, the end of it. It was a practical kindness from a decent man. It meant nothing beyond what it was. She was not a woman who needed rescuing, and she was not a woman who was in the market for attachment, and she was going to drink her evening coffee and review tomorrow's provisions list and go to sleep, and not think about it again. She thought about it again. She lay in her narrow bunk at the back of the kitchen car, listening to the rhythm of the wheels on the iron track, and she thought about the woodpile chopped to exactly the right length. She thought about how long it would have taken someone to notice that the standard length was wrong for her. Not just notice the friction of the process, but understand why, and then do something about it without announcing the gesture or waiting for thanks. She tried to think of the last time anyone had looked at the specific mechanical details of her work and addressed them for her benefit. She tried genuinely and could not come up with an instance. This frightened her more than his silence had. She rose before her usual time the next morning, an hour before she needed to, and occupied herself with a meticulous inventory of the dry stores that was entirely unnecessary, and tried to remember what she was doing out here on this train and why she had come, and what the plan was, which was to work and be paid and not feel things, and to build a different kind of life somewhere far enough from Carterville that Gerald Holt's shadow could not reach her. The plan did not account for a man who repaired her oven hinge in the middle of the night and never mentioned it. The country outside was getting rougher now. The gentle roll of the lower plains was giving way to the more demanding topography of the approach to Red Ridge, where the land piled itself up into ragged, broken terrain, and the wind took on a different quality, sharper and more personal, as if it had developed opinions about the people passing through. The crew grew quieter in proportion to the landscape's growing severity. Even the most boisterous among them seemed to compress slightly, bringing their voices down and their attention up the way men do when they begin to understand that the environment they are moving through has its own authority. Martha felt it too, but differently. She had grown up inland in a flat agricultural county where the sky was enormous and the horizon was a single, unbroken line. And the openness of the plains had not troubled her. But the Red Ridge country, with its broken rock faces and its wind-scoured gullies and its vast, unpeopled silence, spoke to something in her she had not known was there. It felt like the inside of her own chest had been turned outside. All that space, all that refusal to be anything other than exactly what it was. She began in those days of approach to cook differently. Not better exactly, because she had always cooked well, but with a different intent, something more instinctual and less calculated. She made soups that were thicker and richer, that sat in the belly like ballast. She added warmth to everything, not just heat, but the sensory warmth of deep-flavored broths and roasted grains and smoked meat, the kind of food that does not just fuel the body, but anchors the spirit to the present moment. The men ate more and spoke less and pushed back from the table, looking steadied, and Martha understood that she was cooking not just for their hunger, but for something in them that the approaching country was asking for. Luke Harper ate his meals at the end of the bench as always, and thanked her as always, and said very little. But she noticed in those days that he had begun watching her with a quality of attention that was different from before. Not forward, not presumptuous. Careful. The way a person watches something they have recognized as precious and are afraid of disturbing. She was afraid of it, and she wanted it, and she told herself with an increasingly unconvincing firmness that she was not interested in either of those states. On the 28th day, when the Red Ridge Pass was visible on the horizon and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon, she was lifting the largest cast-iron pot, a vessel that held nearly 8 gallons of stew, when full down from its storage shelf at an awkward angle required by the shelf position, and she felt her wrist buckle under the uneven load. The pot did not fall. She caught it, redistributed the weight, set it down on the stovetop without spilling a drop. But the catch had required a sharp twisting motion, and the pain that shot through her right shoulder was significant enough that she had to stand still for a moment with her teeth set, waiting for it to resolve. When she turned, Luke Harper was standing in the doorway of the kitchen car. He had never come to the kitchen car before a meal. The crew knew better than to enter the cook's domain uninvited, and Martha enforced this understanding with a quality of calm and absolute certainty that most of the men had read correctly from the first day. But Luke was standing in the doorway, not having knocked or called out, simply present with his hat in his hand, and his quiet eyes reading her with that careful attention she had been trying not to think about. She straightened. She made her face professional. "Meal is not for another hour," she said. "I know," he said. He did not move. His gaze moved from her face to her right shoulder and back again, with the directness of a man who has decided that looking away from a true thing is a form of bad faith. "That shelf is positioned wrong," he said, "for those pots." "I manage," she said. "You do?" he agreed. And there was something in the way he said it without argument, without the empty reassurance she would have dismissed, just a plain acknowledgement that yes, she managed, and that her managing was not nothing that made her throat do the thing again that she did not permit. "I could lower it," he said, "tonight, after the meal." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen car swayed gently on its tracks. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the first edge of what she did not yet know would become the worst blizzard in that territory in 20 years. "All right," she said at last, and that was all. He put his hat back on and stepped back out into the corridor, and Martha turned back to her stove, and the world continued exactly as before, except that it was in some way she could not measure, yet irreversibly different. She would not understand until much later that she had just said yes to something much larger than a shelf. He lowered the shelf that night. Martha did not watch him do it. She had finished the evening meal cleanup, scrubbed the stovetop, covered the dry stores, and told herself she was going to her bunk to review the provisions list for the following 3 days, which was a practical and necessary task that had nothing to do with avoiding the sound of Luke Harper working quietly in her kitchen space. She sat on her bunk with the provisions list in her hands and listened to the soft, careful sounds of a man who knew how to use tools without making unnecessary noise. The precise tap of a hammer, the measured turn of a bolt, the occasional pause that suggested someone stepping back to assess the geometry of a problem before proceeding. There was something profoundly disarming about the sounds. They were the sounds of competence applied with care, and Martha had spent enough years surrounded by men who made noise in proportion to how little they were actually accomplishing to understand the difference. She did not sleep for a long time after the sound stopped. In the morning, she went to the kitchen car and found the shelf repositioned at exactly the right height. Not approximately right. Exactly right, calibrated to a height that would allow her to lift the large cast iron pot with her arms at the correct angle, distributing the weight across her shoulders and back in a way that would not torque the wrist or compress the spine. She stood in front of it for a moment and thought about how he had determined the correct height since they had not discussed measurements. He had watched her work. He had watched her long enough with enough of that careful attention to understand the geometry of her body in relation to her tools. She made breakfast with the pot lifted cleanly from its proper shelf, and she did not say anything to Luke Harper when he came to the bench, and he did not say anything to her, and the thanks he offered when she set down his plate was exactly the same as it had always been. But something between them had shifted in the way that tectonic things shift below the surface, invisible from above, but registered in the body as a change in pressure. The days that followed had a quality she did not have a name for. She went about her work with the same fierce, exacting rhythm she had established from the first morning, but there was something different in the air of the kitchen car, now something she noticed particularly in those pre-dawn hours before the crew woke, when she was alone with the fire and the dark planes rolling past the small window. The firewood was always the right length. The oven door swung open cleanly every morning. The shelf sat at its corrected height. These were small things, and she knew they were small things, and she also knew that smallness has nothing to do with weight. Some of the heaviest things she had ever carried in her life had taken up almost no space at all. She began to notice him more carefully than she had permitted herself to before, not with the searching anxiety of a woman trying to determine a man's intentions, but with the quieter, more honest attention of someone who has recognized something genuine and is trying to understand it. He moved through the train with an unhurried purposefulness that she found herself watching from the kitchen car doorway in the brief intervals between tasks. He tended his horses with an ease that spoke of long familiarity, running his hands along their flanks and speaking to them in a voice too low to carry checking their feet and their water, with a patience that did not look like patience because it did not look like effort. It was simply how he was. She had known men who were kind to animals and cruel to people. She had known men who performed tenderness as a kind of currency, dispensing it strategically to produce a desired effect. Luke Harper's care for the horses did not look like either of those things. It looked like the outward expression of an inward orientation, a quality of genuine attentiveness to the particular needs of living things that was not selective, not performed, simply present. This, she told herself, was the most dangerous kind of man. Not dangerous in the way Gerald Holt had been dangerous, which was the danger of a person who sees you clearly as a resource and uses you accordingly. Gerald's danger had been legible in retrospect, written in every interaction she had simply chosen not to read. Luke Harper's danger was of an entirely different order. He was dangerous because he was real, because the things he did were not calculated, because the shelf was at the right height, because he had looked at her working and understood her, not because he wanted something from her, but apparently because understanding was simply what he did, and she was the thing in his field of vision that needed understanding. She had no defenses built for that. All of her walls had been constructed against the other kind. On the 32nd day out, the train stopped for a half-day layover at a small supply depot called Garnet Creek, which was not so much a town as an accumulation of ambition that had not yet decided whether to survive or give up. There was a general store, a water tower, a livery, and a low building that served as both saloon and post office, which said something about the priorities of the people who had built it. The crew dispersed with the enthusiasm of men who have been in each other's company for a month and are ready for 15 minutes of the illusion of civilization. Martha stayed on the train. She had supplies to inventory and a list to give to the depot manager, and beyond that, she had no particular interest in the social life of Garnet Creek. She was working through the flower stores when she heard boots on the kitchen car steps, the particular rhythm of one person rather than the shuffling of several, and looked up to find Luke Harper standing in the doorway with something in his hands. It was a tin of lard. A good quality tin, the kind with a proper seal, which was not easy to find in a depot as small as Garnet Creek. He held it out to her. "The hinges on the left storage cabinet," he said. "I can fix them this afternoon while we are stopped, but they need proper grease, not the mineral oil I used on the oven. I thought this would be better." She looked at the tin, then she looked at him. "The left cabinet is not urgent," she said, which was true. The left cabinet squeaked, and its upper hinge was slightly loose, but it was functional. She had been managing it. "No," he agreed, "but we will hit rougher track before Red Ridge. It will get worse." She considered this. It was like everything he said, entirely practical and entirely true, and she understood in the way she had been beginning to understand things over the past 2 weeks that the tin of lard was not just a tin of lard, any more than the chopped firewood had been just firewood. He was speaking in the only language she had trusted for years. The language of practical care, of attention expressed through action rather than declaration, and he was speaking it directly to her in a way that she could not dismiss as coincidence or general decency. "All right," she said, which was what she had said about the shelf. This time something crossed his face when she said it. It was brief and carefully controlled, but she caught it. Not triumph, not satisfaction. In the shallow sense. Something quieter. Something that looked, she thought, like relief. He worked on the cabinet that afternoon while the train was still. She worked around him in the kitchen car, preparing the evening meal, and they occupied the same space for nearly 2 hours without speaking more than a handful of words, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable. It had the quality of a silence that two people have agreed upon together, a shared quiet that requires a certain level of trust to maintain, because silence between people who do not trust each other is never actually quiet at all. "Where are you from?" she asked at some point in the second hour without fully deciding to ask. He was on one knee in front of the cabinet working the hinge with careful, steady strokes. He did not look up. "Wyoming originally," he said. "Teton country. My family ranched there." "Originally," she repeated. It was a word that carried weight. "Left at 17, he said. "There were reasons." He paused. "Most things a person leaves at 17, there were reasons." She turned back to the onions she was cutting. "Yes," she said, "there usually are." He did not ask her where she was from. She had a feeling he already had a sense of it. Not the geography, but the shape of it. The general outline of a person who has been somewhere that asked too much and is now somewhere else figuring out what remains. She found she did not mind him knowing the outline. It was the details she protected. The cabinet door swung silently on its repaired hinge. He stood and tested it several times and then put his tools away with the same economical precision with which he did everything. He turned to find her watching him, and she did not look away in time. The moment held. It was not long, perhaps 3 seconds, the span of a breath, but it had a density to it that she felt in her sternum. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-brown, the color of the plains in late afternoon when the light goes flat and honest, and there was in them at that moment an expression so direct and unguarded that Martha felt something in her chest respond before she could stop it. She turned back to the stove. "Thank you," she said to the pot of onions. "Thank you for the meals," he said. "Every one of them." He left. She stood at the stove with her hand on the wooden spoon, listening to the sound of his boots retreating down the corridor, and breathed very carefully in and out until the feeling in her chest settled back to something she could govern. She was in trouble, and she knew it. The trouble was not the kind she had been in with Gerald Holt, which had been a gradual, comfortable sinking into a warm bath that turned cold only after she had been in it too long to climb out without injury. This was different. This was the trouble of something real. She could feel the realness of it, the way you can feel a weather change in old joints, a deep bone-level recognition that something is coming and that the ground under you is already beginning to shift in response. She had built her current life on the conviction that she was not owed comfort, beauty, or tenderness. She had accepted this as a permanent settlement, a peace treaty with a world that had made its position clear. She had her work and her strength and her competence, and these were not nothing. She had learned to hold them with a certain bruised pride. She was the woman who kept the men alive on this train. She was the woman who hauled the heavy pots and stoked the iron stove, and produced 3 hot meals a day in a moving metal box with inadequate supplies and irregular provisions, and she was very good at it, and that was her life, and it was enough. It had been enough. Before a man started chopping her firewood to the right length and fixing her oven hinge in the dead of night, and looking at her with those flat, honest, gray-brown eyes like she was something worth the looking. She told herself at some length and with considerable force that she was imagining things. That a decent man performing decent acts was not the same as a man with feelings. That she was a woman who had been starved of ordinary consideration for so long that the most basic human attentiveness read to her as something more than it was, because her frame of reference was permanently warped by years of exploitation. This was, she believed, a reasonable and psychologically sound explanation, and she clung to it, because the alternative was to admit that something was happening, and admitting that something was happening would require her to be afraid of losing it, and she had learned in the most thorough and expensive way possible exactly what it felt like to lose the thing you had allowed yourself to want. The train left Garnet Creek at dusk. The sky to the northwest had taken on a color that the older members of the crew noted without speaking, a particular greenish gray at the horizon that sat below a ceiling of dense, fast-moving cloud. Martha noticed the sky and filed the observation in the part of her mind that tracked conditions alongside the temperature drop she had felt that afternoon and the way the horses had been restless in their car all day, shifting and stamping with a persistence that was not their usual travel discomfort. She served the evening meal and cleared after it and scrubbed the stovetop and covered the stores, and when she finally climbed onto her bunk and pulled the heavy blanket around her shoulders, she lay in the dark and listened to the changed quality of the wind outside the car and thought about Wyoming at 17 and reasons and the particular loneliness of a person who has learned to manage everything alone. She thought about what it would mean to put something down. Not weakness, not surrender, just the simple, terrifying act of not carrying a thing alone. For once, she did not have an answer for that. She was not sure she had ever had one. In the darkness, the wind built steadily, and the temperature outside continued its long fall, and the Red Ridge Pass waited ahead of them in the frozen dark like a held breath, and Martha Doyle lay in her bunk and felt underneath the fear and the discipline and the thick, careful walls she had built around the softest parts of herself, the unmistakable, dangerous warmth of something she had given up expecting. She felt very quietly, and very much against her will, the first stirring of hope, and it terrified her more than anything the wilderness outside had yet seen fit to throw at her. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of the wind trying to take the train apart. It was not the gradual escalation of a building storm. It arrived with the sudden total authority of something that had been waiting just beyond the horizon for exactly the right moment, and that moment it had decided was now. The kitchen car shuddered on its frame with a violence that sent the hanging tin ladles swinging against each other in a frantic, discordant chime, and the temperature inside the car had dropped so severely in the hours she had been sleeping that her breath was visible in the thin gray light coming through the frost-covered window. Martha was on her feet before she was fully awake, which was a reflex built from years of being the first person up in any household she had ever occupied. She pulled on her heaviest coat and her wool cap and moved to the stove, which had burned down to coals in the night. She worked quickly and without panic, feeding the coals with the correctly sized kindling from the stack by the wall, building the fire back with the practiced economy of someone who understood that heat was not a comfort in this moment, but a survival condition. Through the window she could see nothing. Not the plains, not the sky, not the outlines of the other cars ahead of her. There was only white, moving white, a wall of driven snow so dense it had effectively erased the world beyond the glass. The train had stopped. She did not know when it had stopped or why, but the absence of the wheel rhythm beneath her feet, so constant for the past 5 weeks that she had stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing a clock, was now conspicuous as a missing heartbeat. She had the stove going strong and the large pot filled with water from the reserve barrel. When she heard voices in the corridor, low and urgent, the particular register of men who are not yet frightened but are standing at the exact border of it. She pulled open the kitchen car door and found 3 of the crew in the narrow passage, their faces carrying the raw, stunned look of people who have just stepped outside and immediately stepped back in. "How bad?" she asked. The oldest of the 3, a heavy-set man named Cord, who had been making this run for 7 years, looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "Bad enough," he said. "We are in the pass. The track ahead is drifted under. Silas says we cannot move forward and we cannot back the train out until the wind drops. Could be hours, could be longer. How much longer?" Cord glanced at the other 2 men, and the glance said what he was not willing to say out loud. "Weather like this up in the pass," he said carefully. "It has its own schedule." Martha looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the kitchen. "Go tell the rest of the crew to get in here," she said. "All of them. This is the warmest car on the train, and we are going to keep it that way. I need every man moving wood from the forward storage to this car before the drifts make it impossible to cross between them. Do it now, while you still can." Cord hesitated, not from reluctance, but from the mild surprise of a man who has received a clear direct order from an unexpected source, and is taking a moment to register that it is the correct order. Then he nodded and went. Martha turned to the stove and began calculating. She knew her supplies. She knew her coal and her wood reserves and her food stores with the precise, detailed intimacy of someone who had been responsible for them every day for 5 weeks. She ran the numbers in her head with the focused speed of real necessity. Not the abstract necessity of planning, but the concrete necessity of keeping 14 men alive in a frozen metal box at the top of a mountain pass in a blizzard that was showing no particular interest in their survival. She had enough, if she was careful. If she managed the fire with discipline and the food with intelligence and the morale with the particular steady authority that a cook has in any confined situation, because the cook controls the warmth and the nourishment and the smell of the space, and these are not small powers when the world outside is trying to kill you. She was building the first large pot of broth when Luke Harper came into the kitchen car. He came alone ahead of the crew, which told her he had already been up when Cord reached him, or possibly had never slept. He was fully dressed, and his face was composed with the particular stillness she had come to associate with him when he was thinking hard about something practical. He looked at the stove and the pot, and the careful, deliberate way she had already organized the workspace for extended high-volume cooking, and something in his expression settled as if an internal question had been answered. "Tell me what you need," he said. Not can I help, which would have required her to grant permission and assign tasks from a posture of graciousness she did not have time for. Not what can I do, which placed the organizational burden on her. Tell me what you need. Direct and calibrated to exactly how she worked. The wood from forward storage needs to be here, she said without looking up from the broth. Stack it against the right wall, not the left, because the left gets the draft from the door. I need someone managing the fire who understands banking it for sustained heat, not just throwing wood at it. And I need the men to stay out of this end of the car while I am cooking unless I ask for them. I can manage the fire, he said. She looked up then. He was already moving toward the wood pile, assessing the stack, calculating the burn rate in his head with the same quiet efficiency with which he did everything. She watched him for a brief moment, this man from Wyoming at 17, and felt something in her chest that she did not examine closely because there was no time, and because examining it would require a kind of stillness she could not afford. "All right," she said. The crew filtered in over the next 20 minutes, loud with cold and noise, and the particular anxiety of men who have been in danger before and know what it feels like, but have not yet made peace with this specific instance of it. Martha put them to work. She gave each man a task with the flat, unargued authority of someone who is not asking and does not need to, and they took their tasks and did them because the kitchen car was warm, and she was the source of the warmth. And in that moment her authority was as natural and absolute as geography. The blizzard lasted 3 days. This was not immediately apparent. On the first day there was still a quality of temporary inconvenience to it, a general sense among the crew that the weather would break by evening and they would be moving again by morning. Martha did not share this assessment, but she kept it to herself and managed the stores accordingly, quietly, having the portion sizes in the broth and increasing the starch and fat content to compensate, filling the men up with denser, slower-burning food that would sustain their body heat without depleting the provisions at a rate she could not support. Luke noticed. She saw it in the way he watched her portion the bowls, the brief calculation in his eyes, and then the deliberate absence of comment. He understood what she was doing and why, and he said nothing about it to the other men, and she registered this understanding as the particular form of respect it was. By the second day, the pretense of temporary inconvenience was gone. The wind had not dropped. The snow outside the car windows was drifted to a height that made the world outside look like a different planet, white and absolute, and entirely without reference to the ordinary. 2 of the younger crewmen had grown quiet, with a fear they were trying to hide and not quite managing. An older hand named Breck had a cough that had worsened steadily since the first night, a deep, rattling thing that made the others glance at each other with careful sideways eyes. Martha made Breck a separate preparation, a strong broth with rendered fat and dried herbs she had brought in her personal supplies, which were modest but included certain things she had learned from a woman in Carterville who had known a great deal about the medicinal applications of the ordinary kitchen. She brought it to him in his bunk without announcement and set it down and said, "Drink all of it," in a tone that did not invite negotiation. He drank it and did not argue, and by the second evening his cough had eased enough that the others stopped exchanging sideways glances. In the kitchen car, the space that was technically her domain had become, by the logic of survival, a shared one. The men rotated through in shifts, warming themselves by the stove and drinking the thin but hot and steady supply of broth and coffee she maintained around the clock. She slept in 2-hour intervals when she could braced in the corner of the bench seat and woke each time with the clean, immediate alertness of someone whose body understood that full sleep was a luxury the situation had suspended. Luke did not leave the kitchen car. This was not discussed and not negotiated. It simply became the arrangement as natural and unremarked as everything else he did. He managed the fire with a skill that she recognized as equal to her own, maintaining the temperature, with a precision that conserved wood without allowing the heat to drop to a level that would compromise either the cooking or the men's warmth. He moved around the space with a consideration for her work that was so complete and so automatic that after the first several hours she stopped noticing his presence as a separate thing and began to incorporate it into her sense of the kitchen, the way you incorporate a well-placed piece of furniture as something that simply belongs where it is and makes the room function better. They worked in their shared silence, and in that silence, with the blizzard howling against the iron walls and the fire holding steady and the soup pot simmering in its low, constant way, something happened between them that neither of them named, and both of them felt. It was not romantic in any of the ways Martha had been taught to recognize romance. There were no soft words, no deliberate nearness, no performances of desire. What there was, instead, was something older and more fundamental. It was the intimacy of people who are keeping each other alive. The knowledge that the fire he tended was the fire that kept her hands warm enough to cook, and the food she produced was the fuel that kept him strong enough to haul the wood, and this mutual dependency was not a weakness in either of them, but a truth about human beings in extremity that civilization spends a great deal of effort toward obscuring. On the second night, deep in the 3 o'clock hour, when the rest of the crew was sleeping, and the wind outside had reached a pitch that was almost musical in its sustained fury, Luke sat down on the bench on the far side of the stove within the circle of its warmth, and Martha sat on the other side with her cup of coffee, and they were quiet together for a long time. "You are not afraid," he said eventually. It was not a question exactly. She considered it honestly. "I am afraid," she said. "I am choosing not to act from it." He looked at her over the stove. The firelight did what firelight does to a human face, which is to strip away everything that is performance, and leave only what is underneath. And what was underneath, Luke Harper's face in that moment, was something so unguarded and direct that Martha felt it land in her chest like a hand placed over her heart. "That is braver than not being afraid," he said. She looked down at her coffee. "You manage the fire well," she said, which was not what she meant to say, but was the safest true thing she could find. "I have had good fires to learn from," he said. A pause. "And bad ones." She looked up at him. He was still watching her with that careful, honest attention that she had spent 6 weeks trying to find a way to be unmoved by. "Wyoming," she said. "Wyoming," he confirmed, and there was a whole history in the single word, a history she did not ask for and he did not offer, but that was there between them in the firelight, acknowledged and respected, the way two people who have both been shaped by loss sometimes recognize each other across the specific geography of what they have survived. "My father was a good man," he said after a while, "but the ranch failed, and when a man's life work fails sometimes, he does not survive it intact." He paused. "I left because staying would have meant watching the ending, and I was 17, and I could not watch the ending." "Did you ever go back?" she asked. "Once," he said. "It was too late by then." Another pause, quiet and clean. "Some things you cannot time correctly, no matter how long you wait." She thought about what it cost him to say that. She thought about the particular weight of a truth that a person has been carrying alone for a long time, and the decision to set it down even briefly, even incompletely, in the presence of another person. She recognized it because she had been carrying her own truth for the same approximate distance, and the weight of it was something she had grown so accustomed to that she had nearly forgotten it was not a permanent feature of her skeleton. "I gave 10 years to a man who decided I was not worth keeping," she said. She had not planned to say it. The words arrived from somewhere below the level of planning, from the place where the real things live, and once they were in the air between them, she felt the particular exposed vulnerability of a person who has just said a true thing to someone whose opinion matters. Luke did not respond immediately. He looked at her in the firelight with an expression that was not pity, which she would have hated, and not the practiced sympathy of a man who knows what a woman wants to hear. What it was a quality of witnessing, of receiving what she had said, and holding it with the weight it deserved, without trying to resolve it or correct it or minimize it. "He was a fool," Luke said at last with a simple, quiet certainty that was not gallantry. It was a statement of fact from a man who had been watching her for 6 weeks and had formed a clear-eyed opinion. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the iron walls with a sustained and massive force, and the car held, and the warmth held, and the two of them sat in the light of the fire they had tended together, and were for that extended hour in the deep cold of the mountain pass entirely honest with each other. She did not weep. She was not a woman who wept easily, and even if she had been, this was not that kind of moment. It was quieter than tears. It was the feeling of a hand opened after years of being held in a fist, the slow aching return of circulation to something that had been closed for a very long time. On the third day in the early afternoon, the wind began to drop. It did not stop abruptly. It descended in stages, losing its highest register. First, the shrieking, furious pitch that had been constant for 60 hours, and settling into something lower and more sustainable, which was still formidable, but which had lost the quality of absolute intention. The crew felt it before they could explain it, that subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that registers first in the shoulders, a slight easing of the bracing that every body in the car had maintained unconsciously since the storm began. Silas Finn came back from the front of the train with snow in his beard and a different expression on his face than he had been wearing for 3 days. "Track ahead is clearing on the north side," he said. "Wind shift. If it holds, we can have the men digging by evening." The relief in the car was a physical thing, a warmth that was separate from the stove, generated by 14 men, simultaneously releasing a breath they had been holding for 3 days. Someone laughed, a real laugh, the first one Martha had heard since before the storm, and it seemed to break something loose in the room, and the others followed, and the kitchen car filled briefly with the particular loud, unguarded joy of people who have been in genuine danger and have come out the other side. Martha stood at her stove and felt the relief move through her body in a wave that was, she realized, larger than the situation warranted. It was not only relief at the storm breaking. It was relief at something else, something she had been holding with equal tension through these 3 days, the terrible, exquisite closeness of the last 70 hours, the firelit nights and the shared silence and the things said in the 3 o'clock dark, and the knowledge that the extraordinary conditions that had made those things possible were ending. She turned from the stove and found Luke standing near the woodpile, not watching her, looking toward the window where the white beyond the glass was beginning very slowly to differentiate itself into shapes and distances again. His profile in the returning light was still and unhurried, and she looked at him and felt the full weight of what had grown between them in this iron box in the frozen pass, wordless and unasked for and entirely real. She turned back to her stove. She had a meal to make for 14 men who had just survived a blizzard and were going to need something that tasted like victory. She reached for the salt, and her hand was steady, and her face was composed, and underneath both of those things, her heart was beating with a force and a frequency she had not felt in a very long time. It was still terrifying. She had not changed her position on that, but the cold outside was breaking, and the light through the window was changing, and somewhere below, the fear in the same quiet place where the hope had first stirred 3 nights ago. Something warmer had taken hold and was burning now with the steady, patient persistence of a fire that has been properly laid and will not be easily put out. The digging took the rest of that day and most of the following morning. The crew worked in rotating shifts, clearing the drifted track ahead of the train with shovels and their own considerable stubbornness, while the wind continued its gradual retreat, and the sky overhead shifted from the flat, suffocating white of the storm to something thinner and colder, and finally, by late afternoon, to a pale winter blue that was the most beautiful thing Martha had seen in 3 days. She watched it through the kitchen car window while she cooked that slow return of color to the world and felt it in her chest as something almost unbearably tender. She fed the digging crews in rotations hot food brought to the car door at regular intervals, dense and warming, the kind of meals that put strength back into worked-out muscles and reminded a man's body that it was not finished yet. She moved through the cooking with her usual focused precision, but something in her had shifted in the aftermath of the storm, some internal calibration that she could not quite name. The kitchen felt different. The space that had seemed merely functional for 5 weeks now felt inhabited in a way it had not before, as if the 3 days of enforced closeness had left something in the walls, some residue of warmth that was not entirely attributable to the stove. Luke worked the first digging shift and the third, which was 2 more than most of the crew managed, and when he came back into the car after the third shift, his hands were raw from the cold and his shoulders carried the specific set of a man who has been working past the point of comfort and has not mentioned it. Martha saw it and said nothing, and put a bowl of broth on the shelf beside him without being asked, and he drank it standing up without comment. And that was the whole of the exchange, and it was enough. The train moved again on the morning of the 38th day. The first lurch of the wheels resuming their work produced a cheer from the crew that was entirely genuine. The pure, unperformed joy of movement restored after stillness of forward direction, recovered after 3 days of suspended time. Martha felt the vibration of the track return to her feet and her hands and the base of her spine, that constant underlying rhythm she had stopped hearing, and now heard again as if for the first time, and she understood with a clarity that surprised her that she had been changed by the stillness. Not broken. Changed. The way extreme cold changes metal, not by damaging its essential nature, but by altering the arrangement of its constituent parts. The pass gave way gradually to the descending terrain on the eastern side of Red Ridge, and the landscape through the window transformed as they moved, shedding the stark compressed drama of the high pass for the broader, more accommodating geography of the lower country. The sky expanded. The light changed quality. And in the distance on the afternoon of the 39th day, the crew began to see the first indications of Harlan Falls, the railway town that was their destination, a dark suggestion on the flat horizon that resolved slowly into buildings and water towers and the geometry of a place where people had decided to stay. Martha saw it and felt the first cold finger of something she did not want to feel. She knew this sensation. She had felt it before, not on a train, and not in the West, but in the parlor of a house she had furnished herself on a September evening that had reorganized everything she understood about her own life. It was the sensation of a threshold, of a before and an after, arranged on either side of a single moment that has not yet arrived, but is visibly approaching. She had crossed that kind of threshold before, and she knew what waited on the other side of it, which was a world that saw her exactly as she was, large and work-roughened and practically skilled and socially invisible, and rendered its verdict accordingly. The storm and the pass and the frozen kitchen car had operated outside of that world's jurisdiction. The pass did not care about the circumference of a woman's waist, or the roughness of her hands, or the social class implied by the soot in the creases of her knuckles. The pass cared about heat and food, and the practical intelligence to provide both under impossible conditions, and at these things Martha Doyle was extraordinary, and she had felt her own extraordinariness there in a way she had not felt anywhere else in her adult life. She had felt it in the way the men deferred to her authority without questioning it, in the way the storm had been met and managed and outlasted, in the way Luke Harper had looked at her across the fire in the 3 o'clock darkness, and said with the quiet conviction of a man stating an observed fact that the man who had discarded her was a fool. But that had been the pass. This was Harlan Falls, with its buildings and its water towers and its population of people who had not been in the blizzard and did not know what she had done there, and would see her stepping off the kitchen car in a smoke-stained dress with her broad hands and her practical build and draw their own immediate familiar conclusions. She told herself very sternly that she did not care about the conclusions of strangers. She had never cared about them, or rather, she had always known that other people's opinions of her physical person were not relevant to her actual value, and she had held this knowledge in front of herself like a shield for most of her adult life. The problem was that a shield held in front of a wound is not the same thing as a healed wound, and somewhere in the last 6 weeks, somewhere in the woodpile, and the oiled hinge, and the repositioned shelf, and the fire-lit nights, in the frozen pass, the wound had opened again and was no longer safely behind the shield. She became aware of the change in herself over those final hours of travel, in the way you become aware of weather, not all at once, but through accumulating signs. She found herself quieter at the stove, moving through the meal preparations with the same physical competence as always, but with a growing internal stillness that was not peace. She found herself pulling her apron straighter and then stopping with her hands on the fabric and making herself let go of it, because adjusting her apron was something she did when she was anxious about being looked at, and she was not going to be that woman. She refused to be that woman, and then she was that woman anyway, adjusting the apron again 20 minutes later without noticing she was doing it. Luke came to the kitchen car in the late afternoon, not at a mealtime. She had her back to the door, and she knew it was him by the particular quality of the silence that accompanied his presence, the specific absence of noise that was different from the absence of noise that accompanied everyone else. Less like the silence of someone trying to be quiet, and more like the silence of someone who is simply fundamentally comfortable with the absence of unnecessary sound. "We will be there by tomorrow morning," he said. "I know," she said. She did not turn from the stove. A pause. She could feel him reading the quality of her stillness, the way he read everything with that careful, attentive honesty that she had never found a way to be invisible against. "Martha," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formality of a full sentence around it. Just the name alone, spoken with a directness and a gentleness that were not in competition with each other, that occupied the same word simultaneously, the way light and warmth occupy the same fire. She felt it move through her like a current. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway, not filling it, not positioning himself to fill it, just standing in it with his hat in his hands, and that expression on his face that she had been cataloging and defending against for 6 weeks, the one that was not performance and not strategy and not anything she had a prior name for. "I want to say something," he said, "before we arrive, while it is still just us." She waited. Her hands were folded in front of her apron, and her face was composed, and her heart was doing something that she was managing with some effort. "What happened in the past?" he said, and then stopped, and she saw him choosing his words with the care of a man who knows that the wrong word will close a door he does not want closed. What happened in the past was real. For me, not because of the storm or the cold or the circumstances. I want to be clear about that. Those things did not create it. They just removed the things that were in the way of it. She looked at him. The train moved under them, both the familiar rhythm returning, carrying them steadily toward the horizon where Harlan Falls waited. "You are the most capable person I have ever shared a space with," he said, "and the most honest. And I have been trying for 6 weeks to find a way to say that which would not make you put a wall up, and I have not found one. So I am saying it plainly and hoping the plainness counts for something." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the descending country moved past in the afternoon light, broad and golden and indifferent, in the way the land always was, not cruel, but simply unconcerned, leaving the human beings in the iron box to manage their own interior weather. "It counts," she said. And then, because honesty had been the language between them from the beginning, and she was not going to debase it, and now she said, "I am afraid." "I know," he said. "Not of you," she said, and the distinction was important, and she needed him to understand it. "Of arriving, of being seen there, and having you see how they see me, and having that change things." He looked at her with an expression of such clear, unequivocal steadiness that she felt it as a physical weight, solid and reliable. "It will not change things," he said. "You cannot know that," she said, which was true and which was also the voice of Gerald Holt's parlor, talking the voice of a September evening that had reorganized her understanding of what she was worth in the open air of the world, and she knew it was that voice, and she could not fully silence it, because some voices get into the architecture of a person and become structural. Luke was quiet for a moment. He did not argue with her, which she had expected, or reassure her with easy words, which she had also expected. He said, "You are right that I cannot guarantee how others will see you. I can only tell you what I see." He paused. "I see the woman who kept 14 men alive in a blizzard, who manages this kitchen with a skill I have never seen matched, who chose not to act from fear at 3 a.m. when the wind was trying to take us apart." Another pause, shorter. "I see Martha Doyle, and I am not going anywhere." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was longer than she had ever held it, and she felt the words reach her through all of the insulation she had spent 10 years building, not dissolving it, but finding the places where it had thinned and moving through them, and she thought with a clarity that was almost painful that this was what it felt like to be seen. Not just looked at, seen. "All right," she said, which was what she always said to him when she had no other answer, and which had become, she realized, their private language for yes. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He left the doorway, and she heard his boots moving down the corridor, and she turned back to her stove, and her hands were not entirely steady, which was something she acknowledged and did not try to fix. She slept badly that night. The train rocked on the descending grade, and the rhythm that had always been soporific was now insistent and purposeful, carrying her forward toward the thing she was afraid of, and her mind worked in the way it worked in the dark, turning over every sharp edge and presenting it in sequence. She saw herself stepping off the kitchen car in front of a proper town's population. She saw the gap between what she was and what the world's categories preferred a woman to be. She saw faces performing the particular kind of appraisal that people with social standing perform on people. They have decided to assess the quick up and down, the calculation, the conclusion worn openly, because the wearer is confident that the person being assessed has no recourse. She had seen those faces before. She had seen them at Gerald Holt's first dinner with his new circle of acquaintances, when she had still believed herself to be part of his future, when she had stood at the edge of a parlor in her best dress and watched a woman in expensive silk look at her with an expression of such thorough casual dismissal that Martha had understood in that moment the verdict before Gerald had found the words for it. She had been too broad, too vigorous, too physically substantial, too obviously a woman who had worked with her hands and her back and her genuine ability when what was wanted was something ornamental and compact and unthreatening. She pressed her face into the rough pillow and told herself that Harlan Falls was not Gerald Holt's parlor. She told herself that she was not the same woman who had stood at the edge of that room in her best dress. She told herself that Luke Harper had said plainly and without decoration that he was not going anywhere, and that she had chosen with her eyes open and her history intact to believe him, and that belief was not naivety, but an act of will, and it was one she was capable of sustaining. She almost convinced herself. She very nearly succeeded. And then the morning came. Harlan Falls was larger than she had imagined from the distant darkness of its first appearance on the horizon. It had a main street of proper width with buildings that had permanent ambitions, a bank, and a dry goods and a hotel of 3 stories, and a church whose steeple caught the morning light with the quiet confidence of an institution that expected to be there for a long time. The platform beside the rail line was broad and well-maintained, and it was populated even at this early hour with a substantial gathering of people who had come to meet the train. Some of them were families, wives, and children with the particular bright, compressed energy of people waiting to be reunited with someone they have been worried about, though the worry is already converting to relief because the train is visible and arriving and whole. These were the good faces in the crowd, open and full of genuine emotion, and Martha watched them through the kitchen car window as the train slowed and felt a warmth for them that she did not begrudge. But crowds in Martha's experience were never composed entirely of the good faces. And Harlan Falls, for all its steeple and its 3-story hotel, was still a place with its social architecture intact, its layers and its judgments, and its women who had the time and the inclination to notice other women and render verdicts. She saw them on the platform as the train eased to its stop, a cluster of 4 near the far end, corseted and precisely dressed in the way that women dress when they have come to a public event and intend to be seen at it. They were not there for anyone on the train. They were there, as far as Martha could tell, for the event itself, for the presence of survivors and the drama of arrival and the opportunity that any public gathering provides for the performance of one's own visible quality. She could not hear them from the kitchen car. She did not need to. She could read the conversation in the movements of their heads, the angled glances toward the kitchen car, where the soot and the smell of sustained cooking had laid their evidence on every external surface, the small controlled expressions that are the social currency of women who have decided that the measurement and comparison of other women is a primary occupation. Martha stood in her kitchen in her smoke-stained dress and her work-roughened hands and felt the cold move through her that she had been dreading since the sight of Harlan Falls on the horizon the previous afternoon. The cold was not the blizzard cold, which was external and honest, and could be met with wood and fire and practical intelligence. This cold came from inside, from the old wound that the past had opened from the part of her that had been told in a calm and social voice that she was the wrong size and shape and texture for the visible world. She began systematically and with full awareness of what she was doing to make herself smaller. She pulled the apron straighter. She moved toward the back of the kitchen car. She told herself that she could remain on the train a little longer, that there were stores to cover and surfaces to clean, practical necessities that would keep her in the kitchen car until the crowd had dispersed and the platform had emptied and the moment of exposure had passed. She was reaching for the flour sack, manufacturing a task, when she heard boots on the kitchen car steps. Not Luke's particular silence. Silas Finn, heavy and purposeful, ducking his big head through the low doorway with his beard still carrying evidence of the blizzard. He looked at her with the direct, unsentimental eyes of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at. "Crew is disembarking," he said. "Time to step out, Doyle. People want to see who survived." She looked at him. Her hands were folded on the flour sack. "I have stores to cover," she said. Silas Finn looked at the stores which were covered. He looked at the surfaces which were clean. He looked at Martha Doyle standing in the back of her kitchen, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen from him before in 7 weeks. It was respect-specific and earned the expression of a man who has watched someone perform under genuine pressure and has formed a clear-eyed understanding of what that performance cost and what it was worth. "The stores can wait," he said, not unkindly. "Come out, cook. You earned the walk." She stood for a moment longer in the kitchens that had been her world and her sanctuary and her survival for nearly 6 weeks, with its correctly sized firewood and its properly hinged oven door and its repositioned shelf, and she thought about the blizzard and the 3 o'clock fire and the things said in the dark, and she thought about 10 years given to a man who had found her disposable, And she thought about the particular cruelty of a world that assigns value to human beings on the basis of their surface dimensions. And then she thought about a woman who had kept 14 men alive on top of a frozen mountain and who had risen before dawn every day for 6 weeks in a smoke-filled iron box, and who had managed provisions and fire and morale and sustenance, and had not once in all of that time required anyone's approval to do it. She untied her apron. She folded it and laid it on the clean work shelf with the care and deliberateness of a woman completing a chapter. She smoothed the front of her smoke-stained dress with both hands, not the anxious smoothing of someone trying to hide themselves, but the steady finishing gesture of someone preparing to be exactly and entirely what they are. She picked up her coat. She walked to the kitchen car door. She stepped out onto the iron steps into the cold, clear morning light of Harlan Falls, and the world was loud and bright and full of faces, and the 4 women at the far end of the platform turned their careful, appraising eyes toward her, and she felt the full, cold weight of their assessment land on her like a hand pressed flat against her chest. She stopped on the second step, not from fear, from the simple fact of arriving somewhere real, somewhere that was not the protected geography of the past, and needing a single moment to let that reality settle into her bones. That was the moment Luke Harper came around the front of the kitchen car. He had washed. He had shaved. The trail dust and the blizzard were gone from him, and in the clear winter morning he was objectively a figure that the crowd on the platform noticed, because people notice certain things without making a decision to, and Luke Harper in the morning light at Harlan Falls was the kind of figure that stops a moment in its tracks. He was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at the platform, or the hotel, or the women in their corseted precision at the far end. He was walking directly toward her. His eyes found her on the second step of the kitchen car, and he walked toward her with the same unhurried, purposeful economy with which he did everything, and the crowd parted for him without quite knowing why, and he stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at her, and he took off his hat with his right hand and extended his left, open and steady and absolutely certain. Martha Doyle looked down at his hand. She looked at his face, at the expression on it that was not performance, and had never been performance, the clean, honest certainty of a man who has made a decision and is not confused about it. She heard at the edge of her awareness the murmur from the direction of the 4 women, the recalibrating rustle of people whose narrative is being revised without their consent. She placed her large, calloused, soot-stained hand in his. He helped her down from the step as if she were made of something precious, and she was, and she knew it. And the knowing of it was the most terrifying and the most solid thing she had felt in 10 years. Her hand in his felt like the conclusion of a sentence that had been left unfinished for 10 years. She was aware of everything at once, the cold morning air on her face, the solid weight of the platform planks beneath her feet, the murmur of the crowd rearranging itself around this unexpected development, and the warmth of Luke Harper's hand around hers, steady and unhurried and entirely certain. He did not grip her hand the way a man grips something he is trying to hold in place. He held it the way a person holds something they are choosing deliberately and with full knowledge of what they are choosing. She stepped down from the final iron step and stood on the platform of Harlan Falls, and the world was very loud and very bright, and she was in it fully, and without the protection of the kitchen car or the frozen pass or any of the other enclosed spaces where she had been briefly and fiercely entirely herself. The 4 women at the far end of the platform had stopped their conversation. She could feel their attention without looking at them, the particular quality of stilled appraisal that meant a calculation was being revised. She did not look at them. She looked at Luke, who was looking at her with the same expression he had worn in the firelight at 3 a.m, clean and direct, and without anything in it that needed to be decoded. Silas Finn came down the platform steps behind them, and then Cord, and then the rest of the crew in the loose, relieved way of men who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it. They gathered on the platform with the blinking, slightly stunned quality of people emerging from a long interior space into open air, and a handful of townspeople moved toward them with questions and exclamations, and the platform filled with the overlapping noise of reunion and relief. And then one of the four women separated herself from the group at the far end and moved toward the kitchen car steps with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who has decided to make a point. She was perhaps 50, with the precise, expensive presentation of a woman who has made a long study of being seen correctly, and her eyes went to Martha with the particular quality of appraisal that Martha had been bracing against since the first sight of Harlan Falls on the horizon. She stopped a few feet away. Her gaze traveled from Martha's smoke-stained dress to her calloused hands, to the sturdy, powerfully built frame that no amount of careful dressing would have transformed into the corseted silhouette the woman clearly considered the appropriate architecture for a female person. The assessment took perhaps 4 seconds. It was not subtle. "You were the cook," the woman said. The inflection was not quite a question. Martha felt the cold move through her, that old familiar cold, the cold of Gerald Holt's parlor and the dinner party where a woman in silk had looked at her with casual dismissal. She felt the reflex to make herself smaller, to agree with whatever the tone was implying, to take up less space in apology for taking up the space she actually occupied. She did not do any of those things. "I am the cook," she said, present tense, not past, clear and without apology. The woman's expression shifted slightly, recalibrating around an unexpected quality of steadiness, and she opened her mouth to say something further, and Luke Harper spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He did not adopt the posture of a man preparing for confrontation. He simply spoke in the same quiet, carrying tone that he used for everything, the tone that derived its authority not from volume, but from the complete absence of uncertainty behind it. "This is Martha Doyle," he said to the woman, to Silas Finn beside him, to Cord and the crew gathering on the platform, to the townspeople who had turned toward the small drama of it without quite knowing why. "She kept every man on this train alive through 3 days in a blizzard at Red Ridge Pass. She managed the provisions, the fire, the crew's warmth, and their morale when the temperature dropped to conditions that would have defeated most people I have known." He paused not for effect, but in the way a man pauses when he is choosing the next true thing carefully. "She is the finest person I have traveled with in 20 years of hard country, and she is the only woman I intend to spend the rest of my life with if she will have me." The platform was quiet in the way that platforms are not usually quiet. Martha turned to look at him. He was looking at her, not at the crowd, not at the woman in the expensive dress, not at Silas Finn, whose eyebrows had made a significant upward journey. He was looking only at Martha, with the full, unhurried attention that had been his defining quality from the first meal, when he had thanked her and met her eyes for a brief moment before looking away, and which had been quietly, persistently dismantling her defenses for 7 weeks. She was aware that her face was doing something she could not fully control. Not weeping, she was still not weeping, but something adjacent to it, a softening around the eyes and mouth that was the outward sign of an internal structure releasing a load it had been carrying for longer than she could precisely calculate. He reached out with the same steady deliberateness with which he did everything, and took her right hand, the broader one, the one with the scar on the thumb from the hand axe and the permanent roughness of years of heavy kitchen work, and he lifted it and pressed his lips against the back of it with a gentleness so specific and so unhurried that it was not a gesture for the crowd. It was not performance. It was a man communicating something to a particular woman in the only language that had ever passed between them, reliably the language of careful, deliberate, practical devotion. The woman in the expensive dress said nothing further. She withdrew with the dignity available to someone whose opening position has been conclusively answered, and her three companions at the far end of the platform found reasons to turn their attention to other things, and the crowd on the platform gradually remembered itself and returned to its own reunions and conversations. And Martha Doyle stood in the cold morning light of Harlan Falls, with her work-roughened hand held in Luke Harper's, and felt the last of the old cold leave her body, like heat leaving iron slowly and completely and without drama. "You might have asked me first," she said, which was the first thing she could find to say that was not too large for the moment. A very slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "I was fairly certain," he said. "Were you?" she said. "You said all right twice," he said. "To the shelf and the cabinet. I took them as indications." She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet man from Wyoming at 17 with his careful eyes and his economy of motion and his habit of fixing things in the night without announcement, and she felt something in her chest complete itself with a solidity she had not known she was still capable of. Like the last stone settled into a wall that has been under construction for a very long time. "All right," she said, the third time. And she meant all of it, the shelf and the cabinet and the rest of it, the whole accumulated weight of the only word she had ever been able to give him that was entirely true. Silas Finn, who had witnessed the exchange with the expression of a man who has been surprised by the day, but intends to process it privately, and at length cleared his throat and produced from his vest pocket a folded envelope that he extended toward Martha. "Contract payment," he said. "Full amount plus the bonus for Red Ridge completion. You earned every cent of it, Doyle. More than." She took the envelope with her free hand. She did not open it on the platform. She tucked it into her coat pocket with the particular careful composure of a woman who has learned not to display the significance of money in public, because money had been scarce for long enough in her life that its presence still felt fragile and required protection. "Thank you, Silas," she said. He nodded gruffly and with sincerity. "If you ever want a return run," he said, "the position is yours. I have never had a cook who managed a blizzard like that." "I will think on it," she said, which was polite and also honest, because she genuinely did not know yet what came next, and she had learned in the hard way that most lasting lessons are learned not to make commitments before she understood the shape of what she was committing to. What came next turned out to be a conversation conducted over the following 3 days in the relative warmth of the Harlan Falls Hotel dining room between Martha and Luke, in which the practical architecture of a shared future was laid out with the same directness that had characterized everything between them. It was not a romantic conversation in the decorative sense. It was two people who had established a common language of honesty sitting across from each other and using it, which is perhaps the most genuinely romantic thing two people can do. Luke had stakes in a piece of land 4 miles east of Harlan Falls, purchased 2 years prior, with money saved from 15 years of cattle work and horse trading, a modest acreage with a serviceable house and outbuildings and good well water and soil that he believed had more potential than its previous owner had troubled to develop. He had been running horses on it with the help of a hired man during the months he spent on the trail, and it was functional but spare a working man's beginning rather than a finished thing. Martha listened to this with the evaluating attention she brought to any practical problem, asking specific questions about the outbuildings and the well depth and the proximity to the main road and the nature of the soil, which surprised him slightly and pleased him considerably. She was not listening for the reassurance of abundance. She was listening for the truth of the situation, and the truth was modest and honest and entirely workable, which suited her better than abundance would have. "There is a building on the main street," she said on the second day. "Corner of First and Calloway. I walked past it this morning. It has been empty for a while. You can see it in the windows. The right size for a dining room and a kitchen. Good corner position, good foot traffic." He looked at her. "You walk the town." "I always assess a new place," she said. Not defensively, simply as information about how she was built. He was quiet for a moment, and the quality of his silence was the particular one she had learned to recognize as him organizing something he wanted to say carefully. "The contract money," he said, "combined with what I have set aside. It would cover a lease and the equipment to start." "I know," she said. "I calculated it last night." A pause. "Of course you did," he said, and there was in his voice a warmth so unguarded that she had to look down at her coffee cup for a moment. "A restaurant," she said. "Proper meals, not saloon food, the kind of food that the people in this town cannot currently get without traveling to the county seat." She looked up. "There is a real business there. I know food, and I know people's hunger not just for calories, but for something that tastes like care. That is not a common thing to find, and people will pay for it when they find it." "I know," he said. "I have been paying for it in one form or another for the past 7 weeks." She looked at him. He was entirely serious and also very slightly not. "You are occasionally almost funny," she said. "I am working on it," he said. The lease on the corner building was signed on the 4th day. Martha negotiated it herself across the desk of a property agent named Burwell, who had the instinctive manner of a man accustomed to paying women less attention than the situation warranted, and who revised this approach approximately 2 minutes into the conversation when it became clear that Martha Doyle understood contracts, costs fair market rates, and the particular leverage of a tenant who has visible community support from people like Silas Finn and the return train crew. She got the lease at a rate that was fair and not a cent more. Luke witnessed the signing from the chair against the wall with his hat on his knee, and his expression one of undisguised admiration. Outside the office, he said, "You have done this before." "I ran a man's business for a decade," she said, "without credit or compensation. I know what I was doing." A pause, and something crossed her face that was not bitterness, but its cleaner residue, the neutral acknowledgement of a truth that has been processed and set down. "I know what it is worth now." He looked at her for a moment. "So do I," he said. The work of converting the corner building into a proper restaurant took 6 weeks, during which Martha lived in a rented room above the dry goods store, and Luke rode out to his land each evening and back each morning with the regularity of a man who has found a reason to make the ride worth making. They worked on the building together in the afternoons alongside a hired carpenter whose skill Martha assessed with characteristic directness and found adequate, and who found Martha a more exacting employer than he was accustomed to and rose to it with the universal human response to being genuinely expected to do good work. The kitchen was designed by Martha from the ground up, and it was perfect. The shelves were at the right height. The stove was new, a proper commercial iron range that she had sourced from a supplier in the county seat after rejecting 2 local options as insufficient, and its door swung on a hinge that was correctly fitted from the beginning, which gave her a satisfaction she did not entirely explain to Luke, though from the expression on his face when she tested the door the first time she thought he understood it anyway. She did not hide herself during those weeks. This was not a decision she made consciously or announced. It was simply what happened when a woman who has been operating under the sustained conviction of her own unworthiness begins to have evidence daily and undeniable that the conviction was wrong. She moved through Harlan Falls with the same physical presence she had always had, her broad, sturdy frame and her strong hands and her direct gaze, and she did not apologize for any of it, with her posture or her voice or the careful making small that she had practiced for so long it had become invisible to her. People noticed this quality in her, the particular uprightness of it, and responded to it in the way that people generally respond to genuine self-possession, which is with a respect that is not given but recognized. The 4 women from the platform were a different project. She did not pursue them, and she did not avoid them. When she encountered them, as she inevitably did in a town of Harlan Falls' size, she was courteous and direct and entirely herself. And this was, she had learned the most effective possible response to that variety of social judgment, because it offered nothing to push against and nothing to dismiss, only the plain and somewhat inconvenient fact of a person who knows exactly what she is worth. The restaurant opened on a Tuesday morning in March, which Martha chose deliberately because Tuesday mornings in September were the time zone of the worst day of her previous life, and she intended to give Tuesday mornings new associations. She called it the Hearth, which was not a complicated name, but it was the right name because the hearth is the oldest human gathering point, the place where warmth and sustenance and community converge, and this was what she intended to provide. The first customers were Silas Finn and Cord and 3 other members of the Red Ridge crew who were still in the area. They arrived at precisely the opening hour and settled at the large center table with the particular satisfaction of men who feel they have a proprietary connection to an enterprise which they did in a way that Martha did not begrudge. She cooked for them herself that morning the same deep-flavored, generous, carefully prepared food she had made in the kitchen car. And when Cord pushed back from the table with the expression of a man who has just been reminded what real cooking tastes like, she felt a satisfaction so clean and complete that it needed no external verification. By the end of the first week, the Hearth had established a waiting list for the evening meal. By the end of the first month, Burwell, the property agent, had come in twice for lunch and had stopped making the particular category of eye contact that implied surprise at her competence. By the end of the second month, a woman named Clara Fitch, who was the wife of the town's largest ranch owner and who had been one of the 4 on the platform that first morning, came in for an afternoon coffee and sat alone at the window table for an hour, and then on her way out paused at the counter where Martha was working through the next day's menu and said quietly and without the corseted precision of her usual presentation that the apple cake was the finest thing she had eaten in 3 years, and that her late mother had made something similar, and that she had not expected to be reminded of her mother today, and was not displeased to have been. Martha looked at her, this woman who had been part of the appraisal on the platform, and she saw what she had not been able to see that first morning, which was a person underneath the assessment with her own griefs and her own hungers. Neither better nor worse than any other person, simply human and hungry in the ways that humans are. "Come back Thursday," Martha said. "I am making the full version with the brown sugar crust. Bring someone you want to feed well." Clara Fitch came back Thursday. She brought her daughter. It was the beginning of something that Martha did not have a name for yet, which was, she suspected, exactly how the best things begin. Luke came for dinner every evening that he was in town, which was most evenings. He sat at the small corner table near the kitchen door, not the center tables where the community gathered, and he ate his meal with the same quiet appreciation he had brought to every meal she had ever cooked for him, from the first plate on the freight train bench to the ones she now set before him in her own dining room. He never rushed. He never treated the corner table as anything other than exactly where he wanted to be. After the dinner service, when the last customers had gone and the kitchen was clean and the fire in the hearth was burning down to its comfortable late-hour warmth, he would stay, and they would sit together in the way they had sat on either side of the blizzard stove in their shared silence that was not the absence of conversation but its deepest form. Sometimes they talked about the ranch and the restaurant and the practical decisions that a shared life generates in steady, manageable supply. Sometimes they did not talk, and the silence between them was the most comfortable space Martha had ever occupied. One evening in April, sitting in that after-dinner quiet with the hearth light warm on the walls of her own room in her own place, in a town that had learned her name and her work and had made room for her, exactly as she was, Martha Doyle understood something that she had been approaching for months but had not yet arrived at completely. She understood that she had not been too much. She had never been too much, She had simply been in the wrong place, in the service of the wrong person, in a life that had been designed to use her gifts without honoring them, and she had endured this for so long that she had begun to believe the design was the truth about her. It was not. It had never been the truth about her. The truth about her was the hearth full and warm every evening, and the food that came out of her kitchen carrying the particular quality of something made by a person who has finally stopped apologizing for her ability. The truth about her was the correct shelf height, and the oiled hinge, and the chopped wood, all the small, careful daily acts of a man who had looked at her and seen something worth the looking, and had communicated this in the only language she had ever fully trusted. She looked across the table at Luke Harper, who was reading a letter from the hired man at the ranch, with the unhurried attention he gave to everything, and she thought about Wyoming at 17, and reasons, and the long trail that leads a person from where they start to where they belong. She thought about the pass and the blizzard and the 3:00 fire. She thought about her hand placed in his on the platform steps and the weight of being held as if she were precious, which she was, and which she had finally at some cost, and after considerable delay, learned to believe. "Luke," she said. He looked up from the letter. "I am glad the oven hinge was broken," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then the very slight shift at the corner of his mouth that was his version of a full smile moved through his expression like a quiet light. "So am I," he said. The hearth fire settled and threw its warmth across the room and outside the window. The spring night was soft and wide, and Martha Doyle sat in the life she had built with her own strong hands, loved completely, and at last, and was in the deepest and most permanent sense of the word home.